Hello, my name is Kamilian, and in this series, I share unpopular opinions of mine on movies, TV shows, and games. I'm starting off 2023 with a big one, and I don't really know where to start. Almost certain I'm going to forget or not mention a couple things. I'm going to go, oh my god, I should have said this after I've posted this, and I'm going to get roasted in the comments, but that's what this series is about. I'm sharing unpopular opinions of mine. So, with that, I believe that the Hobbit trilogy holds up to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, I'm not trying to tell you this as a fact, nor am I trying to change your mind. I also just want to clarify that I did not say as good as, I said holds up to. Two different things in my eyes. Now, I know this is a big one and a massive stretch for a lot of people. Bear with me. All I ask is that you hear me out. The Lord of the Rings story is a huge fantasy epic with many thematic elements, carried by some of the greatest action and war sequences of all time. Honestly, Helm's Deep and Pelennor Fields are better, in my opinion, than any other huge battle in any movie in recent years. The trilogy has multiple characters in different places at once, but it tells a cohesive story without delving too deep into the very odd lore that Middle-earth has to offer. Those movies are masterpieces in every sense of the word. The Hobbit movies, on the other hand, feel much smaller in scale. The battles in the first two films are, in fact, very small, with the side of the quote-unquote good guys being the dwarves Bilbo and Gandalf totaling 14. But naturally, this is far shy of the numbers we see in the battles of Lord of the Rings. But that's okay, because the story that's being told isn't about some huge quest to save the world from a dark overlord. It's just about some dwarves that want to get back to their home. The movie's action scenes are much more lighthearted in tone as well. You see the dwarves passing weapons around, literally clambering over the top of one another, and then there's Dane. Enough said. CGI. When fans criticize elements of CGI in big budget films, they tend to overlook the elements that actually work well. In most instances, the more prevalent CGI elements, such as the creature designs and the motion capture, is almost flawless. The Hobbit movies received criticism for focusing more on CGI creatures as opposed to the more practical effects heavy production of The Lord of the Rings. However, fans seem to ignore more significant parts of the film, like Azog the Defiler, Smaug the Dragon, Gollum, and so on, that put stellar CGI and motion capture on display. Smaug, for example, remains one of the very best full CGI creations of recent cinema, despite concerns of his overall appearance. A feat that made all the more impressive given the Desolation of Smaug was released in 2013. Every element of that character was perfectly rendered, from his size, the detail of his creation, or the seamless motion capture performed by MCU star Benedict Cumberbatch. While characters like Azog received criticism in comparison to practical characters like Lurtz or Gothmog from Lord of the Rings, fans often take little to no notice of how well integrated the CGI is for such characters. In fact, nearly all of the orc or goblin creations look seamless within the rest of the film, while also allowing for more outlandish designs than practical effects would have. Another significant improvement from the Lord of the Rings CGI was, of course, Gollum. While Gollum and his CGI and motion capture were significantly praised for Lord of the Rings, the same isn't often said for The Hobbit, simply due to the inclusion of more CGI elements, leading to creatures like Gollum fading into obscurity despite their fantastic CGI, enabling Gollum to have one of the best scenes in the entire trilogy. On a more personal note, I love the designs and obvious visual differences between some of the different orc races in the Hobbit films as opposed to what they ended up being in The Lord of the Rings. It was very hard for me trying to distinguish the differences between Uruk-hai and orcs in The Two Towers the very first time I watched it all those years ago, whereas there are clear differences between some of the goblins and more distinguished orcs in the Hobbit films. Whilst you can see differences in Lord of the Rings, the differences are that much clearer in The Hobbit, with not everything looking like a human in a costume. Thanks to CGI. Not in the book. A lot of people seem to take issue with things that happen throughout the Hobbit trilogy which supposedly never took place within the book. Whilst Peter Jackson most certainly took liberties with some aspects, a lot of what people are complaining about could very well have taken place within the book without us actually connecting the dots in the films. Or it could have very well happened in parallel within other writings from the Tolkien family. For example, in The Hobbit, the chapter The Clouds Burst, it references elf lords. So who are these nameless elf lords? It seems reasonable to suggest that Legolas could very well have been one of them. On another note, The Hobbit could very well have been written from Bilbo's perspective, and Bilbo only sees Legolas 3 times in the entire trilogy. Number 1, Bilbo has the ring on and is running past him through the gate into the Elven Kingdom. He has zero context at this point as to who Legolas is. Number 2, Legolas is leaping and bounding from bank to bank of dwarf heads whilst killing orcs. Bilbo has his head underwater for the majority of this scene as he was clutching for his dear life to the side of a barrel. 3, outside of Erebor, Legolas arrives after returning from Khand Dûm, and Gandalf says his name in full in front of Bilbo. It's actually still a pretty faithful adaptation, despite what most people think. Almost everything that's in the book is actually in the movie, presented almost in the same way, if not exactly the same way, involving the same characters, especially if you encounter the extended editions. And honestly, whether it be The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, you only watch the extended editions. Anyway, there's just a lot more in the movies. Granted, some of the things that were left out were some of the things that I personally would have loved to have seen, such as Gwaihir chatting with Gandalf. But other than that, there is nothing of any super importance that I can immediately recall that was missing. Peter Jackson and the writing team clearly intended to make the prequel to their own cinematic version of The Lord of the Rings. This movie doesn't exist to emulate the more childlike fairy tale tone of the Hobbit book. That simply wouldn't have gelled well with the existing movies. In negative reviews, people have often compared the Hobbit trilogy to the Star Wars prequels. And you all know how I feel about the Star Wars prequels. I completely agree though. Both are awesome trilogies that increase the world building and general epicness, for lack of better terminology, of the overall saga in both cases. If you love Lord of the Rings, and a major issue of the Hobbit trilogy for you is the accuracy to the books, or things were included in there that just were not in the original Hobbit text or parallel texts from the Tolkien family, please keep in mind that Arwen doesn't rescue Frodo. Glorfindel does. Gimli doesn't impulsively try to destroy the ring at the first meeting. Aragorn does not fall off a cliff when fighting wargs. In fact, that entire battle never takes place. Elves never came to help in the battle for Helm's Deep. Gandalf does not lose his staff as Gandalf the White, and there are many, many more things that were added into the Lord of the Rings movies, which we absolutely love, which never happened or had a drastically different turn of events. Don't even get me started on the lack of Tom Bombadil. It was never going to be as good as Lord of the Rings. Arguably, the main thing the Hobbit movies receive criticism for is the fact they simply aren't as good as Jackson's original Lord of the Rings trilogy. This, however, leans into unrealistic fan expectations that set The Hobbit up to fail before production even began. The Lord of the Rings films are three of the most acclaimed movies of all time. The third film in the series, Return of the King, is, at the time that I'm writing this, tied with Titanic and Ben-Hur for the most Academy Award wins with 11, while also being the only film in history to win every single award it was nominated for. These films being derived from three of the most beloved, inventive, best-selling fantasy novels in history, it only makes sense for the films to be of such quality. It should never have been expected for the Hobbit movies to ever live up to this impossibly high standard. With the Hobbit films being based on a 310-page children's book, the initial source material was similarly never intended to be as much of an epic, wide-reaching story as its sequels. Although Jackson's decision to expand into a trilogy is understandable for me anyway, and lends to the Hobbit series greater depth, what differences there happen to be between the source material means that a straight comparison was never going to be a fair metric. Given all of this, fans' expectations that The Hobbit would reach these similar highs as opposed to simply being enjoyable high fantasy films on a much lesser scale ultimately led to much of the disappointment aimed at the trilogy. To be a little critical, if viewers had simply checked their expectations before viewing each movie, and even now accept that The Hobbit was never supposed to be precisely the mirror of Lord of the Rings, I believe it would have led to a much more rewarding and enjoyable experience, which allowed fans to focus on the merits of these amazing movies, rather than endlessly compare them to the unobtainable heights of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. Given the volume of discussion, it would be very easy for the regular audience or people unfamiliar with the franchise to take it as gospel, viewing the Hobbit trilogy as simply not great and a pale imitation of Lord of the Rings. However, while some criticisms levied against the films are certainly valid, the so-called flaws might not actually be flaws at all. With the Hobbit movies featuring a whole lot of positives, it's clear that Peter Jackson's second Middle-earth trilogy definitely deserves another chance. In my opinion, the Hobbit trilogy very easily outmatches the vast majority of both fantasy movies and adventure movies out there right now. The best part about all of this is that it's just my opinion. And at the end of the day, that's all it is. It's just my opinion. The Hobbit trilogy, being worthy of a trilogy and holding up to Lord of the Rings, is just my opinion. It is not fact. As I said at the beginning, I'm sure I've forgotten many points that I would like to make, but this video has already gone on long enough and I don't want to keep rambling. So regardless of whether you do comment, whether you hit the like or dislike button, whether you subscribed or not, thank you for clicking on the link in the first place. But more importantly, thank you for hearing me out.